So in our last class, we talked about the transition of the Roman world from a republic into an empire and the ways that this influenced the treatment of the characters of the people running the Roman Empire. The authors who wrote about Roman history in the 1st century AD were really clear about this connection. The empire did well because, or when, it was ruled by good emperors. And therefore, the people who did a good job running the empire were good people. And bad emperors tended to fail politically because they were bad people. And this went even further in other sorts of official propaganda. So good emperors get this kind of treatment when they die. This is a coin that's issued to celebrate the divination of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. And divination means when he dies, he's made into a god. And so this is a sort of absolute affirmation of a good emperor with a good outcome to the end of his life. But bad emperors got this. And this is something that's called a condemnation of memory, or the damnatio memoriae of a figure. What you see here are two imperial portraits that come and depict the family of the Emperor Septimius Severus. So the Emperor Geta and the Emperor Caracalla both took power after Septimius Severus. The Emperor Geta was killed by his brother, and physically killed by his brother, in the arms of his mother, who you see depicted in the painting. And then the memory of Geta was condemned. And so what you see when someone's memory is condemned is their memory is actually blotted out, but not eliminated. It's blotted out in such a way that you make clear that this person was a horrible person. And so when you look at that painting and you see Suetonius Severus and you see Caracalla and you see Caracalla's mother, and then you see that brown spot, that used to be Geta's face. But Geta's face has been rubbed out with elephant dung, a way to just communicate how horrible a person Geta actually supposedly was. And so when someone's memory is condemned, they get erased, their names get erased, their pictures get erased, their statues get thrown down, and everybody is supposed to remember that this person was a bad person. There are very, very few emperors who fall into a middle ground, where they're neither condemned nor made into gods. One of them is the Emperor Tiberius, but again, this is not normal. Most emperors are either deemed successful, and if they're successful, they tend to be divinized and made into gods, or unsuccessful. And if they're unsuccessful, they tend not to live a natural life, they tend to be killed, and they tend to have their memory condemned. Now, this is the kind of conceptual world that Suetonius is working in when he's writing the biographies of the 12 Caesars. And as we saw last time, Suetonius is a member of the literary elite, a teacher of rhetoric, and then a government official, who for a time actually even worked in the imperial palace as a secretary to the Emperor Hadrian. And because of who he was, and because of the people he worked for, he had a social view that was quite a bit like that of Plutarch, who we described the last couple weeks. A very elitist worldview, how the world worked and who should matter in it. But that also meant that Suetonius is writing for his peers. He's writing for people who are influential, who tend to be relatively conservative, who interact with imperial officials regularly, and sometimes had even met or knew pretty well some of the emperors about whom they're writing. And so, for example, Suetonius himself had met Nerva, he'd met Trajan, he'd probably also met Domitian, and he certainly had met Hadrian. So the goal of Suetonius' text is then to write for and entertain these people, many of whom already had views about the emperors that he describes, who they were, and whether or not they were good people. Now the project begins when Suetonius has a great deal of access to materials connected to the imperial court. But midway through the project, it seems Suetonius is fired from his job in the imperial administration. This is in about the year 121 or 122. And he'd apparently been working chronologically through the 12 lives. And when he loses access to the palace archives, we see that the lives immediately become less detailed and more focused on the kind of gossip that circulated in the world. And so this means that we can't absolutely see each text as exactly the same, because Suetonius had different types of research materials available when he wrote the life of Augustus and when he wrote the life of Domitian, say. But we do generally have a sense across these texts to see how Suetonius presented imperial character and how he also engaged with the expectations of his audience. Now, last time we looked at how Suetonius presented the imperial character of a so-called good emperor and the kinds of strategies he used to ensure that people would think positively about an emperor who was good, while not being able to say that Suetonius had left out some of the bad stories or bad materials about him. And so what we saw in the life of Augustus was a balancing act, where Suetonius would introduce a lot of material that supported the point he was making, but he would occasionally also introduce material that contradicted that evidence or contradicted that impression. But he would introduce it with either sources that were unreliable or with evidence that counteracted it or some combination of those, so that the reader would be able to acknowledge that Suetonius had indeed addressed some of that person's concerns, but at the same time, he dismissed them. He addressed them, but they no longer had any kind of power to undercut the impression that Suetonius was giving. So today we're going to shift gears and look at how Suetonius presents bad emperors. We're going to look particularly at two different bad emperors. The first one is Caligula, the sort of definition of a bad Roman emperor. And we'll then look at how Suetonius takes somebody who pretty much everybody in his audience agreed was bad and goes kind of over the top in emphasizing how bad Caligula actually was. Then we'll also look at how he successfully attacks the character of Domitian, a good emperor more or less, about whom senators had bad feelings, but who the soldiers loved and the common people also seem to have liked quite a bit. And so in Caligula, what Suetonius is doing is he's basically just emphasizing again, or re-emphasizing again, the impression that everybody had that Caligula was terrible. And so what he's able to do then is write a text that entertains, because the argument doesn't have a lot riding on it. You don't have to convince anybody that Caligula was a bad emperor, because everybody already knows it. With Domitian, the task is a little bit different. Not everybody knows that Domitian was a bad emperor. In fact, probably the majority of Romans across the empire don't actually think that. They think Domitian was, on balance, probably a successful emperor. And so what Suetonius has to do there is a little more difficult. He has to convince, not just describe, but also convince that his portrait of Domitian, which may contradict a lot of people's memory of Domitian, is actually the correct one. Now, to do this, it's important, I think, to very quickly bridge the historical gap between Augustus, who we talked about last time, and these emperors that we're talking about now. Now, Augustus creates the imperial form, with imperial power and the nature of his power more or less decided between 30 and 27 BC. And Augustus hangs on for a very long time. He dies in 14 AD after holding power for over 40 years. Now, Augustus is succeeded by his stepson Tiberius. And Tiberius' relationship with Augustus was problematic. Augustus didn't particularly like Tiberius. Tiberius very clearly didn't really like Augustus. But all of the other people that Augustus had chosen to succeed him all died before Augustus did. And so Augustus was sort of left with Tiberius. And so Tiberius took over. It's not clear exactly how excited Tiberius was about the idea of taking over as Roman emperor. But he ruled as Roman emperor for 23 years. And he did a very good job, all things considered. But he wasn't very well liked. This tends to happen with people who take on a job that's a lifetime appointment, but they don't particularly enjoy or really maybe even want the job. And so Tiberius was effective, but there wasn't much joy in how he did his job, and there was a lot of miscommunication that resulted in bad feelings between him and the Senate. And so when he died in 37 AD, he was succeeded by Caligula, the son of this man, Germanicus. And Germanicus was one of the most successful generals in the early empire, and probably would have been Tiberius' successor if he didn't die before Tiberius' death. Now, Caligula had traveled alongside Germanicus when Germanicus was fighting campaigns, and he did this as a young child. And so the story that we're told is that Caligula's real name was Gaius, but he received the nickname Caligula, which means little boots, because when he was serving or traveling with his father, when his father was on campaign, his father gave him a little military uniform, like a little sort of child's military uniform. And so he'd walk around dressed like a little miniature Roman soldier, and he'd wear like little miniature Roman campaign boots. And the soldiers thought that this was cute, so they called him Caligula, or Little Boots, and the name stuck, even though Caligula absolutely hated it. Now, in a weird way, Caligula is probably one of the most famous of all Roman emperors. I think generally, if you ask people to name Roman emperors, the first name that you'll get is probably Augustus. The next name you'll get is probably Constantine. Usually the third name you get is Caligula. And this is because there are two very famous portraits of him that present him as crazy. And Suetonius is the first and the most famous, and we'll discuss that in a minute. But there's another portrait that's also pretty interesting. It was written by the Jewish philosopher from Alexandria named Philo. And Philo went as an ambassador to Caligula following a riot that ravaged the Jewish community in the city. Now, Philo writes about this embassy a little bit after Caligula was assassinated. And so this isn't an account of Caligula that Caligula, for example, could have read. Caligula was dead at the time it was written. And so what Philo is doing is he's already engaging with this idea of Caligula as a crazy person. But Philo talks about this meeting with Caligula, and he says that it took forever for him to get the appointment to talk to the emperor. But when he got the appointment, Caligula held the meeting not in a regular meeting hall where emperors would normally meet with petitioners. Instead, Philo was summoned to go to the site where Caligula was constructing a villa. And so Caligula holds the meeting while walking around the construction site. And so he's half paying attention to Philo and half kind of showing Philo all of the great sort of features of the new building that he's putting together. But that even gives too much credit to what Philo says Caligula is doing, because really Caligula is not listening at all. Philo is a very sophisticated and well-trained advocate, and he's laying out as best he can the case for why the Jewish community in Alexandria needs to be protected. And Caligula is really just not paying attention at all. And then finally, Caligula just kind of loses it. He just becomes super frustrated at this. And he turns to Philo and he just says, why is it that you guys don't eat pork? That's really strange. And Philo is just kind of thrown for a loop. And so he starts trying to explain this. And at this point, Caligula, again, loses interest and starts focusing on other things. Now, the picture that Philo is giving is that Caligula is absolutely unfit to be a Roman emperor. He can't do the job. He just fundamentally can't focus on the kinds of tasks that an emperor needs to do. But other stories in circulation are even more elaborate. Stories circulate about Caligula having incestuous relationships with his sister and even arranging for his horse to be made consul. Now, all of these stories present Caligula as unbalanced, and it's possible that they're right, but they're so extreme that it's hard to believe that they're actually being fully truthful. Instead, what they're clearly designed to do is to justify what happens to Caligula. Caligula is assassinated by members of the imperial guard in 41 AD, and this is an event that needs to be justified. When emperors are killed, you have to basically come up with a way to say why it is that murder was the only solution to the problem this emperor posed. And so the critique or the criticism or the attacks on Caligula are in many ways already set up to justify the action that's going to be taken against him. And Suetonius, when he's writing about Caligula, is writing nearly 65 years after Caligula's death. More than this, actually. And so at this point, the perception of Caligula as somebody who's crazy and unbalanced and incapable of serving as emperor has become really deeply embedded in everybody's mind. It's not something that one questions. It's not something one criticizes. Instead, it's something that becomes a source of exaggeration. And a good storyteller like Suetonius has the task of taking his audience's understanding of someone like Caligula, where there is no doubt or dispute that Caligula was a bad emperor. And he has to make this interesting. He has to, in a sense, make a portrait of Caligula that not only just reinforces what everybody already knows, but does it in a way that is interesting and appealing to a group of people who feel like they already know Caligula. And so what Suetonius does then is stitch together a quilt of the most remarkable Caligula stories. But he doesn't actually just launch into them. What he does instead is he structures this biography much like any other biography would be structured. And the first part of the biography actually spends quite a bit of time on Caligula's family, and in particular the career of Germanicus. Now in some ways, Suetonius had little choice, because by the time of his taking power, Caligula's family, through his connections with Augustus and Tiberius, had been of unrivaled importance in the Roman world for nearly 100 years. But the attacks on Caligula start soon enough in the text. Suetonius tells us that even as a youth, Caligula was unnaturally cruel. And so here's a nice image of Caligula. And you can see in this, it's an image that kind of conveys this almost scary and unstable look of the emperor. And so when we hear about Caligula as a child, what we hear is that he was most eager to witness the tortures and executions of those who suffered punishment, while at night he reveled in gluttony and adultery. And at one point he disguised himself in a wig and a long robe, and was devoted to theatrical arts of singing and dancing. And Tiberius willingly indulged him in this with the hope that his savage nature might be softened. But of course, this didn't work, and Tiberius recognized this, and he used to say now and then that to allow Gaius to live would prove to be the ruin of himself and of all men. And so what this is a passage that Suetonius introduces to kind of foreshadow what will happen to Caligula and what will happen to the empire because of Caligula. This idea that Caligula is a person who is excessively devoted to acts of violence, tortures and executions and similar things, while in his personal life is completely unable to control his passions. This adds up to Tiberius's assessment that Caligula will be ruinous if he's allowed to live. And the next few segments of the life then kind of walk through some of the things that Caligula did that actually were popular. So Suetonius tells us that he put on shows, he cut taxes, he reformed the judiciary, and he gave out gifts of money to people in the empire who needed them. But Suetonius very quickly transitions. At 22, which is again very early in this text, Suetonius says, okay, so much for Caligula as emperor. We must now tell of his career as a monster. And again, this transition is a powerful statement. It's memorable. And it's a powerful statement that indicates that the text is now moving into a different realm. If the first part of the text was talking about what Caligula did in his sort of official duties as emperor, what now we're going to get is all of those stories that emphasize Caligula's moral failings and his unsuitability for office. And the rest of the text then, the rest of the life then, consists of the stories that Suetonius' audience really wanted to hear. The stories that show how crazy the emperor actually was. And so some of these stories are delightful. So one of these is the story of how Caligula dissolved a pearl in vinegar. And this is part of a larger critique of Caligula's far-fetched extravagances. So we're told that Caligula invented new kinds of baths and the most unnatural dishes and drinks, bathing in hot and cold perfumed bath oils, drinking valuable pearls dissolved in vinegar, and providing his guests with bread and meat mixed with gold. And Caligula would remark that a man must be either frugal or a Caesar. And suffice it to say that in less than a year, Caligula squandered Tiberius' entire fortune of 27 million gold pieces. So what's interesting about this is you can see here again the way that Suetonius builds up a powerful and memorable argument. And so the claim here is that Caligula is devoted to extreme and expensive extravagances. And Suetonius gives you a list, just like he did when he talks about all of the good things that Augustus did. And one of these is the charge of drinking valuable pearls dissolved in vinegar. And then these other things about putting gold in bread and meat. But But there's little proof for this. There's no evidence for this. There's no source for this. Instead, the only evidence that Suetonius provides for this is that Caligula took office and inherited a fortune of 27 million gold pieces, and within a year, that was gone. So there's a few reasons to think that we can't really trust this claim. Now, the only firm evidence we have, and it is probably correct, that Caligula blew through this entire 27 million gold piece surplus, but this is the only tangible evidence we have. Otherwise, we have all of these sort of elusive stories that talk about him being wasteful. And how much can we trust these? Well, so to give one example of this, the claim that Caligula used to drink pearls dissolved in vinegar, this is not a story that's unique to Caligula. In fact, you have examples of this from long before Suetonius was writing that refer to other people. So Horace, writing under the Emperor Augustus, says that the son of Aesopus, the actor, wanted to swallow 1,000,000 sesterces. So this is the equivalent of basically 250,000 silver pieces. So that he might swallow 1,000,000 sesterces in one drink, dissolved in vinegar, a precious pearl which he'd taken from the ear of Metella. And how much wiser was he in doing this than if he'd thrown the same in a rapid river or a common sewer? And so here, nearly 100 years before Suetonius is writing about Caligula, you have the same story told about somebody else for the same reason. It's just a way to emphasize ostentatious wastefulness. But this is not the only story like this that we have. Pliny, writing about 40 years before Suetonius, says there have been 2 pearls that were the largest in the whole of history, and both were owned by Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, and they'd come down to her through the hands of the kings of the East. And in accordance with previous instructions, her servants placed in front of her only a single vessel containing vinegar, the strong, rough quality of which can melt pearls. She was at the moment wearing in her ears that remarkable and truly unique work of nature. And Mark Antony was full of curiosity to see what in the world she was going to do. So she took off one earring and dropped the pearl in vinegar. And then, when it was melted, she swallowed it. And so what we see is, over the past 100 years before Suetonius is writing, this story of dissolving pearls in vinegar has become a kind of commonplace that is told over and over again about people who are wasteful. And so, does this mean it's not true? Well, it doesn't say either way whether it's true or not. But it does suggest that this is a story that is sort of floating out there. And you can attach this story to anybody that you want to criticize for being excessively wasteful or devoted to useless extravagance. And so the fact that this is attached to Caligula does not mean that Caligula actually did this thing. It does not mean he actually dissolved a pearl in vinegar. It just means that he has a reputation for extravagance, and this is the kind of thing that people in the Roman world with a reputation for extravagance actually go about and do. Now, what can we make of this claim then? So the one piece of evidence that we have that is verifiable is that Caligula squandered Tiberius' entire fortune. So is that persuasive, first of all? I think that that's probably a true fact as things go. But is Suetonius' explanation for it correct? Here, I think there's good reason to be suspicious. So when Suetonius is talking about some of the popular things that Caligula did, he said that Caligula abolished the Italian 0.5% auction tax, and he paid compensation to a great many people whose houses had been damaged by fire. Any king who he restored to the throne was awarded the arrears of taxes and revenues that had accumulated since his deposition. And so Antiochus of Commagene, for example, got a refund of 1,000,000 gold pieces. Now, what you see here is the Italian 0.5% auction tax. This is one of the main sources of imperial revenue. And Caligula abolished it, cutting taxes in a significant amount, by a significant amount. And at the same time, what he's doing is increasing expenditures, paying money to people whose houses had been burned down, and also giving money back to people to kings who had been allied with the Romans and lost their thrones. And one of these people, we're told by Suetonius, gets a refund of 1,000,000 gold pieces. So we have this one piece of information that Caligula spent 27 million gold pieces in the first year. And what we see is Caligula cuts taxes and increases spending. And increases spending to such a big degree that we know in one particular case, only one of the many, many, many people who benefited from this increase in spending, a person got, Antiochus Comagene, got 1,000,000 gold pieces out of the treasury. So where did the 27 million gold pieces go? Well, 1,000,000 of them went to Antiochus Comagene. The others are consumed by increasing these expenses while cutting the revenue that comes in from taxes. And so did Caligula burn through 27 million gold pieces because he's dissolving pearls in vinegar? It doesn't seem so. Instead, what he's doing is he's engaging in increased spending and decreased taxes, which will basically eat away very, very quickly at any kind of budget surplus that one has. Now, this explains some of the things that Suetonius says about Caligula. Is he unfair in saying that that 27 million gold piece budget surplus that Caligula blows through is due to Caligula doing ridiculous things like dissolving pearls? Yes, that seems to be unfair. But is everything that Suetonius says about Caligula unfair? It doesn't seem so. Some of these things are probably true. So the charges of incest, the random cruelty, the crazy schemes to build massive bridges, many of these are exaggerated. Some of them might be made up. But a lot of these things are probably true. At least there's a germ of truth to them. But some of these stories are patently ridiculous. So the story that Caligula wanted to make his horse consul. So we're told that Caligula gave his horse a stall of marble, a manger of ivory, purple blankets. Purple is a specific and very, very expensive form of dye in this period. So a purple blanket then and a purple blanket now don't mean the same thing. He gave the horse a collar of precious stones. He even gave this horse a house, a troop of slaves, and furniture for the more elegant entertainment of the guests invited in his name. And it's also said that he planned to make him consul. And I think what we can see in this is some things that are certainly possible and some things that are absolutely not. So the stall of marble, maybe. The manger of ivory, probably less likely. The blankets and the collar, possible. The house and the furniture, probably not. Parties in the horse's name, that seems unlikely. And then the plan to make the horse consul. Now here again we see Suetonius playing that game that Plutarch and Suetonius play a lot. They want to introduce an idea, but they don't want to actually be held to the veracity of that idea. And so the idea that Caligula wanted to make his horse consul, well, that's attributed to nobody in particular. It is also said that he planned to make him consul. And so this is a very spectacular and memorable thing, but it's probably not true, and Suetonius knows it's probably not true. But we must remember what's going on and what Suetonius' project is. Suetonius is writing about 70, 75 years after Caligula's death, maybe even longer than that. And at that point, Caligula had become something of a cartoon. So Suetonius had to basically tie his portrait of Caligula back to some form of reality, but also make it interesting. And make it interesting in a way that exaggerates the craziness of Caligula, because this is what his audience is interested in seeing. But there's also a bit of a challenge for Suetonius when he's describing Caligula. A person can't be so unbalanced and also be made emperor. And it's clear that when Caligula took power, he didn't behave this way. And people were not suspicious or alarmed about Caligula taking power. Because if Caligula actually was this unbalanced, this crazy, this dangerous, there's no way that he would have been voted into imperial power or would have been selected for imperial power by Tiberius. And so what Suetonius has is a bit of a challenge. How can he plausibly narrate the career of somebody who is this ridiculously unbalanced but also on some level must have been seen as competent to exercise imperial power at some point. And so there's a bit of a dodge in here. Now, Suetonius believes very firmly that the character of people doesn't change, that it's hardwired and nothing, be it illness or misfortune or negative events in somebody's life, can have the slightest effect on how a person behaves. But in the life of Caligula, he has to make some allowances for this. And so he does kind of try to explain how one can go from someone that most Romans thought was at least suitable for imperial power in 37 to somebody who is seen as so unbalanced he should not even be allowed to live in 41 AD. So Suetonius says, he was sound neither of mind nor body, and he himself realized his mental infirmity and thought at times of going into retirement to clear his brain. It's thought that his wife Caesonia gave him a drug intended as a love potion, which, however, had the effect of driving him mad. And so Suetonius gives us an explanation for this transition from somebody who was capable, at least thought to be capable, of exercising imperial power in 37 AD to somebody who is absolutely incapable of exercising it in 41. Basically, he was given a drug that actually ended up poisoning him, and this made him imbalanced and made him incapable of doing the things that at one point he was able to do. And so Suetonius gives himself a bit of an out. This is an explanation for the madness, but it doesn't actually completely absolve Caligula of the charge of being crazy or the consequences of his behavior. So this is how Suetonius takes a bad emperor and makes the portrait of a bad emperor compelling and interesting. But in some ways, Suetonius' treatment of Domitian is even more intriguing, because unlike Caligula, Domitian was both a capable emperor and he was also seen as somebody who, in many minds of many Romans, ruled very well. So Domitian ruled from the year 81 AD to 96 AD, and he was a member of the Flavian dynasty, the second family that ruled over the Roman Empire. He was the younger son of Vespasian, the general who had won an extremely chaotic civil war after the death of Nero in 68 AD, and Vespasian immediately positioned himself as a sort of pro-senatorial figure. And Vespasian and his older son Titus were very in retrospect, seen as very good and very successful emperors. And this is in part because they positioned themselves in contrast to Nero and Caligula as sort of people who supported an old and established Roman order. But there are a number of other things that they did to make themselves particularly popular. Vespasian began work on this building, what we now know as the Colosseum. They knew as the Flavian Amphitheater, named after the Flavian family that Vespasian and Titus belonged to. Now, the Colosseum was finished in the year 80, and Vespasian had died in 79. So the Colosseum was actually dedicated under Vespasian's son Titus. And so this is a reconstruction of the outside of the Colosseum, and this is an aerial view of the Colosseum now. On the day of its dedication, we're told that Titus provided a most lavish gladiatorial show. He also staged a sea fight on the old artificial lake, and when the water had been let out, he used the basin for further gladiatorial shows and a wild beast hunt. And 5,000 beasts of different sorts were killed on a single day. And so this is one of the most notable things that Titus does. The Colosseum, of course, seated at least 50,000 people. It's a massive, massive structure. And these games that Titus puts on lasted for nearly 100 days. Now, Titus dies almost immediately after the conclusion of these games. And so it's important to appreciate what Titus's entire career looked like. Titus took power in 79, immediately cut taxes and gave gifts to the entire populace of the city of Rome. And then the next year he holds this massive series of games and gladiatorial shows in the new Colosseum, this beautiful and massive new building that he's constructed. And then, not long after they finish, he dies. And he's succeeded by Domitian. Now, by the time Domitian took power, the bill for all of Titus's spending had come due. And there's an additional problem that Domitian faces. Not only does he have to pay for all of the the parties and tax cuts and festivities that his brother has put on, but he himself has no money to do these things to celebrate his own accession to imperial power. And so what happens is everybody has this wonderful memory of Titus, because Titus came in, he cut taxes, he had a great party, everybody enjoyed it, and then he dies and his horrible brother takes power, and his horrible brother then has to raise taxes to try to pay for all of the budgetary deficits that Titus has created. And the Roman state never actually published its budget. And so no one really knew how big the deficit Titus had caused actually was. And nobody particularly understood why Domitian needed to raise taxes or why he couldn't be as generous as Titus had been before. Instead, they just assumed that Domitian is greedy. And to make matters worse, when senators began to attack Domitian as a greedy tyrant, he started arresting some of them. Now, that wasn't a great decision, but in fairness, he did this only after he was almost killed in a coup. And so it's not a surprise that he's going to be suspicious of these people who are grumbling. But Domitian's legitimate fears for his life are ignored in part because senators don't look out for the same sorts of things that emperors do. Senators don't want to pay high taxes, and they're actually not responsible for balancing the budget. And so when they're told that they have to pay high taxes, they complain. And if the emperor compels them to do this, they get really, really angry. Now, the senatorial anger towards Domitian is something that existed below the surface until, as we talked about last time, the coup in 96 AD, where Domitian is killed by the emperor Nerva, and the senators are encouraged to express their discontent about Domitian. What happens for people like Suetonius, who are writing about Domitian, is they are writing in this moment where senators have been encouraged to criticize Domitian. And because of this, the historical memory of Domitian is really shaped by a number of people writing in this decade after Domitian has died. People writing under Trajan who are being encouraged to actively attack the legacy of Domitian, in large part because many of them actually benefited from Domitian. And Suetonius probably benefited more than nearly all of them. And so what this means is that Suetonius is writing under a regime of emperors who have told everybody that they have completely broken with the old model of Domitian. Suetonius needs to embrace this quickly because Suetonius's own early career is something that developed because of the patronage and favor of Domitian. And so if Domitian is somebody who's condemned, someone who is seen as one of Domitian's proteges, or at least one of the people who benefited from Domitian's patronage, needs to criticize Domitian even more harshly than someone else who had very little connection to the emperor. And so Suetonius, when he writes about Domitian, he's reflecting both his own particular lack of confidence or his own particular sort of feelings of exposure as someone who has a connection to this emperor who's now been discredited. But he's also writing for an audience of people that want to hear and want to know how they can think about the regime of Domitian as something different from what they actually remember. But there are reasons to think that Domitian was actually a better and much more popular emperor than these senatorial authors expect. There was, for example, a series of conspiracies launched against Domitian in the late 80s and early 90s in which senators and troops and regular people rally and defend the emperor very aggressively. And most notably, one of the people who does this more aggressively than anyone else is the future Emperor Trajan. And so what we see is, looking at the evidence that actually describes people's actions under Domitian, shows that a lot of people, especially a lot of people who later become very critical of Domitian, actually not only cooperated with Domitian, but actually fought to support and sustain the regime that Domitian headed. But this is not the moment when Suetonius is writing. Even though this is the experience that Suetonius has, Suetonius is now writing at a moment where the goal of his project is to emphasize that Domitian is terrible. That Domitian is terrible in every possible way, and that there's very little redeeming quality that one can identify in the career or the person of Domitian. And so Suetonius begins his life of Domitian like this. He says that Domitian was born on the 9th day before the calends of November, the year when his father was consul-elect and about to enter into the office in the following month, in a street of the 6th region called the Pomegranate, in a house which he afterwards converted into a temple of the Flavian dynasty. He's said to have passed the period of his boyhood and early youth in great poverty and infamy, for he didn't possess a single piece of silver, and there have been those who declared that Domitian was debauched by Nerva, who succeeded him as emperor. Now, when we talked about how these biographies start and the sorts of family background that they give, the genuine family background of Domitian is the son of an emperor and the brother of another. There are very few people in Roman history with a more esteemed pedigree to take imperial power. And so Domitian's family background is actually extremely solid. His father is an emperor, his brother is an emperor, and both of those emperors were made into gods. And so the background that one could write for Domitian's family could focus very strongly on those particular attributes. He is in some ways better positioned than anybody else in the Roman world to take imperial power when he does in 81. But this isn't what Suetonius wants to say, because that is not the family background of somebody who is a bad emperor. And so the family background that he gives of Domitian is bizarre. It says that Domitian was born into great poverty and infamy, even though he was born on the day before his father became consul. Now, this is not an office that people who are poor and infamous get. They certainly don't get that under the emperors. And so this is already incongruous. You don't have somebody who is consul who is also poor and infamous. Now, the idea that Domitian passes his boyhood in a house that is a kind of modest house belonging to somebody who's poor, but is later converted into a temple of the Flavian dynasty also makes very little sense. And the idea that Domitian would be selling his body to the future Emperor Nerva also makes very little sense. None of this, in fact, actually adds up. Now, the facts about the date of his birth and his father's consulship at that time, and the location of his house, and the ultimate rendering of that house into a temple of the Flavian dynasty, all of those facts are true. But the implications of those facts, as Suetonius represents them, are completely disingenuous. Instead, what we have to see is what Suetonius is doing is he's already beginning this attempt to undermine the credibility, or to undermine the profile of Domitian, and to put him into this category of bad emperor. And so what we can see is the fix is already on. And we then see, as the text progresses, more and more material that's put in reinforces this idea that Domitian is a bad guy with a bad character who will be a bad emperor. And so this is a passage that we looked at earlier in the quarter. It's a passage that talks about how at the beginning of his reign, Domitian used to sit in a room and basically just stab flies. Now, it's also, it's a very resonant story. It's a very memorable story. Suetonius does what he does particularly well by closing this story with a nice witty remark so that you remember the story because it finishes with this little quip. But it's also a story that's basically impossible to prove or disprove. Nobody can actually go back and say that this happened or it didn't actually happen. But Suetonius tells it because it sheds light on the cruel and vicious character of Domitian. And the cruel character of Domitian is something that Suetonius develops in another very interesting way. He says that when Titus was emperor, Domitian never once stopped plotting, secretly or openly, against his brother. And when Titus fell suddenly and dangerously ill, Domitian told the attendants to leave him for dead before he'd actually breathed his last. And afterward, he granted him no recognition at all beyond approving his deification. Now, let's stop for a minute and think how ridiculous that is. I mean, was he plotting against his brother? Again, not provable. But how unreasonable is it to say that Domitian basically did nothing to grant recognition to his brother except making him a god? Making someone a god is sort of the highest recognition that you can ever give to anybody. And so Domitian, in Suetonius' telling, did nothing for his brother except the most important thing that one could do for his brother, but Suetonius has de-emphasized that most important thing that one could do for his brother. But the other thing about this is Suetonius is lying. And he's so obviously lying that it's absurd. This is the Arch of Titus. And what you see about the Arch of Titus, this is an arch that's put up to celebrate Titus's victory in the Jewish war, his capture of the city of Jerusalem, and his bringing of the spoils from that war to the city of Rome. And this is a monument that was put up to celebrate Titus by Domitian. This is how everybody walked into the Roman Forum. And so anybody who had ever visited the Roman Forum, and anybody who visits the Roman Forum now, knows that Suetonius' claim that Domitian did nothing to honor his brother, except of course to prove his being made into a god, is not true. You can visibly see it's not true. There's a large marble building that shows you it's not true. And within that marble building, what you see at the very center of it is a celebration of Titus's elevation to the ranks of the gods. And so it's obviously not true what Suetonius is saying about Domitian. And other things that Suetonius describes about Domitian are equally non-suspect. So Suetonius describes his military campaigns as necessary at some moments, but generally unnecessary. But what we know is that Domitian faced a major invasion of Roman territory by people from what's now Romania, as well as a lot of people coming from what's now Germany. And he did a good job of organizing defenses against them. But what he did was he fought these wars in a way that was relatively limited and designed to control the Roman frontier without spending too much money or costing too many lives. According to Suetonius, the games he gave were overly extravagant, though they were less extravagant than those for which Titus earns praise. And then Suetonius also makes Domitian look particularly cruel and suspicious. He tells us that Domitian suspected lots and lots of people were plotting against him, but at the same time, Domitian did have plots that he needed to put down, and he did have to fight a civil war against a general who had built support among the legions in Germany. And so, is he overly cruel and suspicious? I think that that's a very difficult argument to make for somebody who has to be somewhat cruel and suspicious when people are opposing him and threatening his life. Suetonius then goes on to describe his paranoia, his lustfulness, and the events that led to his assassination. Now, this would seem to be a generally awful character, but there's, again, more reason to suspect Suetonius here. Because in speaking about the events after his death, Suetonius says something quite interesting. The people received news of his death with indifference, but the soldiers were greatly grieved, and at once attempted to call him the deified Domitian, while they were prepared also to avenge him had they not lacked leaders, and this they did accomplish a little later by most insistently demanding the execution of his murderers. Now, what Suetonius is alluding to here is something that is very, very significant. When the Emperor Nerva takes power and does not immediately punish the assassins of Domitian, the Praetorian Guard, the only troops that were inside of the city of Rome, rebel and actually force Nerva to kill the people who had been involved in the assassination of Domitian. They were so angry at Domitian's murder that they felt someone needed to be punished. And the soldiers in the provinces were equally angry about this. And this is why Nerva had to turn to the general Trajan and make him his successor. Nerva had to do that because the soldiers were so angry that they wanted to actually attack and overthrow Nerva, but they just didn't have a leader. And the reason they didn't have a leader is because Nerva co-opted Trajan. And so what Suetonius is telling you here is not the full truth. He's hinting at what everybody knew to be true, that there was a significant amount of support for Domitian in the army, even after Domitian was assassinated. But what he's doing is he's downplaying the significance of it. But this part is absolutely true. The senators were overjoyed at the death of Domitian, and they raced to fill the Senate house, where they did not refrain from assailing the dead emperor with the most insulting and stinging kinds of outcries. Now, this is true, but it's not immediately true. The attacks on the legacy of Domitian and the attacks on the people who supported him come a little bit later, after it becomes clear what kind of regime Nerva is going to run. And so what this suggests is that Domitian, like Caligula, is probably now the victim of a senatorial reputation hit that's so severe that it's being used to justify murder. Now, there's no sense anywhere that anyone is particularly upset about the death of Caligula. When the attacks go against Caligula and his reputation, this is something that even the Emperor Claudius, who succeeded Caligula, seems to sign off on. But in the case of Domitian, this really does need to be sold, because the senatorial enthusiasm for his murder is not really matched by anybody else. The regular people in Rome are not enthusiastic that he's dead, and the soldiers are actively angry about this. And so what we need to then keep in mind is that Suetonius' view of Caligula reflects a very broad consensus, but his view of Domitian represents a minority perspective, probably a very small minority perspective. And so whereas the account of Caligula is designed to represent and describe and flesh out what was already assumed by everyone, this life of Domitian is designed to make people accept this minority view that Domitian was a crazy, vicious tyrant rather than a dutiful and responsible leader. And Suetonius can do this because his audience of senators and wealthy Roman elites are willing to listen to this idea. But they're also looking for some direction so that they too know what lines to echo as they work to pivot away from careers where, like Suetonius, they had been very close to Domitian, to now a reality where they have to somehow explain their conduct under an emperor that now everybody is coming to say was unfit and unworthy of the office. And so what Suetonius is doing here is he is, again, making an argument about where popular opinion should fall in the future.